What happens when a man who built an empire on grit and resilience walks into what should be a friendly conversation, only to find himself in a carefully laid trap? When Sylvester Stallone, the icon who taught millions that victory isn't about how hard you hit, but how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage that autumn night. No one expected they were about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire, a battle between respect and ridicule, and ultimately a moment that would remind the world why some legends can never be broken. The studio buzzed with anticipation as the house band's final notes faded into the Los Angeles night. Stage lights bathed the set in that familiar warm glow that's become synonymous with casual celebrity chat and easy laughs. The audience settled into their seats, programs clutched in hands, phones silenced, ready for another entertaining evening of Hollywood banter. They'd come expecting the usual formula: softball questions, rehearsed anecdotes, a plug for the latest project, maybe a funny clip or two. What they were about to witness would shatter every expectation they'd brought through those studio doors. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with the confidence of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. His signature grin wide and welcoming, his movements choreographed by years of practiced ease. Tonight, he announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of enthusiasm and irony that's become his trademark. We have a very special guest, the man who made mumbling an art form. Rocky himself, Sylvester Stallone. The crowd erupted, but there was something in Jimmy's tone, something almost imperceptible to those who didn't know what to listen for. A slight edge, a hint of sharpness wrapped in humor's clothing. Stallone emerged from backstage, and the applause intensified. At 78 years old, he still commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Dressed impeccably in a sharp black blazer over a deep maroon shirt that caught the stage lights perfectly. He moved with that distinctive combination of power and grace that only comes from decades of physical discipline. His presence was magnetic, undeniable. This wasn't just another aging actor desperately clinging to past glory. This was a man who'd fought his way up from sleeping in bus stations to becoming a global phenomenon. And every step he took carried that history. He waved to the audience, his smile polite but reserved, his eyes already reading the room with the instinct of someone who'd learned long ago to recognize danger before it fully revealed itself. Those who knew Stallone's story, who understood the battles he'd fought both on screen and off, might have noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw set just slightly tighter than usual. But to most, he was simply the gracious celebrity, grateful for the applause, settling into the guest chair beside his host. "It's good to be here," Stallone said, his voice carrying that familiar growly quality that's become as iconic as the characters he's portrayed. Jimmy leaned forward, his posture friendly, open, disarming. "Good to have you, Sly," he replied. And then almost as an afterthought added with a grin, "I mean, I was told you'd be bringing wisdom, experience, a few unintelligible syllables, and maybe a protein shake." The audience laughed, a ripple of amusement that seemed innocent enough on the surface. Stallone chuckled, but for those paying attention, his eyes told a different story. They narrowed just fractionally. "Just enough." "Well, I left the protein shake backstage," he replied, his tone still light. "Didn't want to outshine your green juice." Jimmy smirked, clearly pleased with the comeback.
Touché.
He shifted in his chair, settling in for what he clearly thought would be an easy evening of trading barbs with a good-natured celebrity. Little did he know that the man sitting across from him had spent a lifetime in far more hostile territory than a late-night set, and every instinct honed in those experiences was already being activated. The conversation moved forward, seeming to flow naturally enough. Jimmy asked about Stallone's latest film, another action project that had brought the actor back to familiar territory. "So, let's talk about your new movie," Jimmy said, his tone carrying just a hint of condescension. "Another action flick? Or did you finally decide to make something with plot?" The audience laughed, but the sound was becoming more uncertain now. Something was shifting in the atmosphere, though most couldn't quite identify what. Stallone kept his expression carefully neutral, his decades of acting experience serving him well. It's a story about redemption, he explained, his voice measured and calm. A veteran confronting the ghosts of his past. Something that speaks to real-world pain. Deep, Jimmy responded with mock awe, his eyes glittering with what he clearly thought was good-natured teasing. And here, I thought it was just another reason to flex those biceps on screen. More laughter, but it was thinner now, more hesitant. Some audience members shifted in their seats, others exchanged glances. Stallone didn't laugh. His expression remained composed, but there was steel beneath the surface, hardening with each passing moment. Sometimes pain needs muscle, he replied, evenly, each word chosen with precision, not to show off, but to carry the weight. The temperature in the studio dropped. Not dramatically, not obviously, but anyone attuned to human interaction could feel it. The air became heavier, charged with something that hadn't been there moments before. Jimmy looked amused rather than concerned, clearly enjoying what he perceived as a verbal sparring match he was winning. "Wow, that's poetic," he said, leaning back in his chair with theatrical appreciation. "Did Rambo teach you that, or was it Rocky?" Stallone leaned back as well, mirroring Jimmy's posture, but with an entirely different energy. "Funny," he said quietly. "I always thought comedy should punch up, not down." The words hung in the air, like a challenge. Jimmy's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise flickering across his face for just an instant before his professional mask reasserted itself. "Just having fun," he said quickly, his smile tightening at the edges. "Don't want to get Botus slammed on live TV." "Don't worry," Stallone replied, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I only hit when it's scripted." The tension was building now, unmistakable. The studio audience, trained by years of late-night viewing to expect friendly banter and harmless jokes, suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory. This wasn't the comfortable rhythm they knew. This was something else entirely, something that made them sit up straighter, made them pay attention in a way they hadn't expected to. Behind the cameras, crew members exchanged glances. The segment producer, watching from the control room, leaned forward in his chair, suddenly alert. This was either going to be television gold or a complete disaster, and the line between the two was razor thin. Jimmy, sensing he needed to regain control of the conversation, tried to steer things towards safer ground. "Well, let's go back," he said, his tone suggesting magnanimity as though he were generously changing the subject. "The first Rocky film. You wrote it in 3 days, right? Did you just run out of crayons, or a ripple of discomfort ran through the audience?" The joke landed wrong, too harsh, too pointed. Some people laughed nervously, but many didn't laugh at all. They could sense that something was being crossed. Some line that existed between playful ribbing and genuine disrespect. Stallone paused. The silence stretched for just a beat too long, pregnant with meaning. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "I wrote it with everything I had," he said. Each word weighted with history, with truth, with the kind of reality that can't be joked away while sleeping in a bus terminal trying to sell my dog to eat. So, yeah, crayons weren't really the priority. The crowd went quiet, completely, utterly quiet. The kind of silence that screams louder than any applause. Jimmy's face registered something that might have been regret, might have been calculation, might have been both. He'd pushed too far, and everyone in the studio knew it. Stallone leaned forward, his posture changing from defensive to assertive. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice still controlled, but carrying an unmistakable warning. "Sometimes you crack jokes, sometimes you crack dignity. Be careful what you're breaking tonight." The stage was set. The gloves were off. What had begun as a standard celebrity interview had transformed into something far more dangerous, far more real. The audience sat transfixed, uncertain whether they should be excited or uncomfortable, aware that they were witnessing something that didn't follow the usual script. And in the control room, producers scrambled, trying to decide whether to let this play out or cut to commercial early, ultimately choosing to let the cameras roll, unable to resist the magnetic pull of genuine conflict unfolding live. Jimmy Kimmel was no stranger to confrontation. Years of hosting had taught him how to navigate difficult guests, how to turn awkward moments into comedy gold, how to maintain control even when things threatened to spiral. But as he sat across from Sylvester Stallone in that moment with the air crackling between them and the audience holding its collective breath, he made a critical miscalculation. He assumed he still held the power. He assumed that his position as host, his home field advantage, his ability to shape the narrative through editing and audience manipulation would protect him. He was wrong. "You know, Sly," Jimmy said, leaning back with a smile that no longer quite reached his eyes. "You should do stand-up." That comeback was almost intelligible. The emphasis on almost was deliberate. Another jab at Stallone's speech. Another attempt to diminish the man sitting across from him. Stallone didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, almost serene, but his eyes had gone cold. "And you should try sincerity sometime," he replied quietly. "It might shock your audience." The crowd let out an audible sound, a collective ooh that rippled through the studio like a wave. They could feel it now, the shift in power, the realization that this wasn't going to be another easy victory for their host. Some audience members leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that they were about to witness something that might make them complicit simply by being present. Jimmy was clearly enjoying himself, or at least performing enjoyment with practiced ease. He pressed further, apparently unable or unwilling to recognize the warning signs that were becoming more obvious with each exchange. "Let's be honest," he said, his tone suggesting he was about to reveal some uncomfortable truth. "You've made more sequels than Hollywood has original ideas. Ever think of just letting it go?" Stallone crossed his legs slowly, deliberately, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and readiness. "I keep telling stories people want to hear," he said, his voice steady as stone. "Maybe that's the part that bothers you," Jimmy chuckled. But the sound was forced now, theatrical. "Or maybe it's that you keep playing the same guy with a new haircut." The response was immediate and devastating. Better than being a new haircut with the same jokes. The audience roared. Not polite laughter, not nervous titters, but genuine enthusiastic applause. They'd chosen their side, and it wasn't the hosts. Jimmy smiled, but the expression was tight now, strained around the edges. Okay, touché, he said, trying to sound gracious in defeat while already loading up for his next attack. "But seriously, isn't there a part of you that worries people only see you as a punchline?" Stallone leaned in, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every year he'd spent fighting for respect, for recognition, for the right to tell his stories his way, only when hosts like you try to write the jokes. He paused, letting the words land before delivering the follow-up that would shift the entire dynamic of the conversation. "Let me remind you, Rocky wasn't just a film. It was hope for a lot of people who had none." The atmosphere in the studio transformed. The applause that followed wasn't just supportive. It was reverent. People weren't just clapping for a good comeback. They were applauding for something deeper, something that reminded them why they'd fallen in love with Stallone's work in the first place. This wasn't about movies or sequels or box office return. This was about meaning, about the stories we tell ourselves to survive, about the characters that become part of our lives and help us through our darkest moments. Jimmy tried to reclaim the momentum, but he was floundering now, reaching for ammunition that kept misfiring. "But you're a millionaire now, right?" he said, his tone taking on an edge of desperation disguised as aggressive journalism. "Don't you think it's a bit rich talking about struggle?" Stallone's voice deepened, taking on a quality that made every person in that studio sit up and pay attention. "Struggle doesn't expire with a paycheck," he said. And in those words was a lifetime of experience of fighting through poverty and rejection and failure of maintaining dignity when the world told him he had no right to it. It leaves scars, and it teaches you to recognize when you're being used for someone else's punchline. The silence that followed was profound. Jimmy sat frozen for a beat, genuinely unsure how to respond. "You think I'm using you?" he finally asked. And for the first time all evening, there was something real in his voice. Something unscripted. Stallone didn't blink. "You tell me." The audience held its breath. Camera operators adjusted their frames instinctively, sensing that something important was happening, something that needed to be captured. In the control room, The director whispered frantically into headsets, trying to figure out whether they were witnessing disaster or brilliance. Ultimately deciding it didn't matter, because there was no way they were cutting away from this. Jimmy looked uncomfortable now, genuinely rattled in a way his practiced professionalism couldn't quite conceal. He forced a laugh, the sound brittle in the heavy air. "Well, folks," he said, addressing the audience as though they could provide him refuge. "I didn't realize we booked a philosophy major tonight," Stallone smiled. But there was no warmth in it. "Funny," he said quietly. "I thought we booked a host." The studio erupted, not with laughter but with applause, with cheers, with a kind of enthusiastic response that makes it clear who the audience has aligned themselves with. Jimmy clenched his jaw, trying to maintain composure, but the game had changed and everyone knew it. He was no longer winning. He was no longer in control. And with each passing moment, that reality became more obvious. He scrambled for a new angle, reaching for the kind of question that might put Stallone back on the defensive. "So, how do you respond to critics who say your career is just nostalgia now?" he asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. "That without the past, you're not much in the present." Stallone's tone turned colder, dropping into a register that carried unmistakable authority. "Critics talk," he said simply. "Legends work, and I don't need to relive the past. I built it." There was a pause, a moment where the entire studio seemed to collectively process what they'd just heard. And then the audience erupted in thunderous applause. It wasn't just support anymore. It was respect, genuine and earned, the kind that can't be manufactured or manipulated. People were standing now, some of them unable to contain their appreciation for what they were witnessing. Jimmy leaned forward one last time, making a final attempt to regain some semblance of control. "Come on, Sly," he said, trying to inject warmth back into his voice. "Can't you take a joke?" Stallone's smile faded completely. His expression became serious, intent, the face of a man who'd reached a decision. "Can you take the truth?" Silence fell over the studio like a curtain. The kind of silence that swallows everything that makes people aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeats. It was the silence of a moment that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Jimmy looked at the camera, his professional instincts kicking in, even as his composure crumbled. He forced a grin that looked more like a grimace. "We'll be right back after this short break," he announced, his voice tight. "If Stallone doesn't punch me before then," but everyone watching knew the truth. This wasn't just a break. This was a battle line being drawn, and the war was far from over. The cameras cut to commercial, but in the studio, the tension remained, thick and unmistakable, a living thing that filled every corner of the space. The commercial break felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. Makeup artists rushed onto the stage, dabbing at Jimmy's forehead where sweat had begun to bead despite the carefully controlled studio temperature. Stallone sat calmly in his chair, declining offered water. His posture relaxed, but his eyes alert. The audience buzzed with conversation. People turning to their neighbors, whispering frantically about what they were witnessing. On social media, clips from the first segment were already spreading like wildfire. Hashtags forming spontaneously as viewers around the world began to tune in. Sensing that something extraordinary was happening, the lights snapped back on with jarring intensity. The stage manager counted down silently, fingers dropping one by one until the on-air light blazed red. Jimmy straightened his jacket, smoothed his hair, and put on his polished, grin-like armor. "We're back with the one and only Sylvester Stallone," he announced to the cameras, to the studio, to the millions now watching at home. Then, unable to resist, he added, "Voice of a generation, the man, the myth, the what is it now? 80-some-year-old action figure." The audience's laughter was scattered, uncertain. They'd seen where this led before the break, and they were wary now, like spectators at a boxing match who'd watched the challenger land several solid blows and were wondering if the champion could recover. Stallone let the laughter die down before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried that same growly authority. But there was something new in it now, something that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Better to be molded in stone than made of plastic, Jimmy." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, more confident in their support. There was a palpable shift in the studio, a divide forming between those who still stood with their host and those who'd been completely won over by the legend sitting in the guest chair. Jimmy noticed it, felt it in the way the applause seemed to bypass him entirely, flowing directly from the audience to his guest. "Well, I have to say," Jimmy continued, pretending not to feel the change in the room's atmosphere, "your fans are loyal, almost aggressively so, like they think you're still that scrappy underdog from Philly." "I am," Stallone said simply, with a kind of certainty that comes from absolute self-knowledge. "I just wear better shoes now," Jimmy scoffed, a sound that came out harsher than he probably intended. "But come on, Sly. Haven't we moved past the whole underdog thing? Isn't it time to hang up the gloves?" Literally and metaphorically. Stallone looked him straight in the eye, and in. That gaze was steel, unbreakable, and unyielding. "You ever tell a soldier to hang up his boots because the war makes you uncomfortable?" Jimmy blinked, clearly not expecting the comparison, not ready for the weight it carried. The air in the studio grew heavy again, that same oppressive tension from before the break, returning with renewed force. "I don't think making a Rocky IX qualifies as war," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. "It does," Stallone replied, his words precise and deliberate. "When you're fighting cynicism, apathy, and the belief that people like me can't still inspire." The audience burst into sustained applause. Several people stood, their enthusiasm genuine and overwhelming. Stallone's voice, steady and calm throughout, carried a weight that no amount of clever writing could manufacture. This was truth speaking, raw and undeniable, and it resonated in a way that polished jokes never could. Jimmy attempted another jab, desperately trying to regain the upper hand. "So, what you're saying is it's not ego, it's mission." "No," Stallone said, his patience clearly fraying now. "It's responsibility to remind people that you don't stop because the world tells you to. You stop when you decide you're done." Powerful words. Jimmy nodded, then added quickly, unable to help himself, spoken like a man trying to sell a box office ticket. Stallone's eyes hardened to chips of flint. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, like watching storm clouds gather on a previously clear horizon. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice dropping to a level that made everyone lean forward to hear. "You keep trying to turn this into a punchline. Maybe because deep down you're afraid someone might take me seriously." The crowd erupted in a way they hadn't all evening. This wasn't just applause anymore. This was validation, recognition. The sound of people who'd been waiting for someone to say what they'd been thinking. Jimmy sat back, visibly rattled now, his composure cracking in ways his professional training hadn't prepared him for. "You want to know what scares me, Sly?" Jimmy said, trying to sound calm, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the conversation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. "It's that people think your on-screen persona is who you are, that Rocky is real." Stallone leaned forward slowly, deliberately, his movement drawing every eye in the studio. When he spoke, his words carried the force of absolute conviction. "Rocky is real," he said. And in those 3 words was a lifetime of belief of fighting for something larger than himself. Not just because I wrote him, but because millions of people saw themselves in him. "He's a mirror, Jimmy. Something you clearly avoid looking into." The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was electric, charged with the kind of energy that precedes lightning strikes. The tension had crystallized into something tangible, something everyone in the studio could feel pressing against their skin. Crew members stood frozen at their stations. The audience sat transfixed, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell was being woven in real time before their eyes. In the control room, the director made a split-second decision. Let it play out. Don't cut to commercial. Don't intervene. Whatever was about to happen was too important, too real to interrupt. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment, every expression, every word that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. Jimmy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He knew he'd lost control of the interview, but his pride wouldn't let him back down, wouldn't let him take the gracious exit that might have saved the situation. Instead, he pressed forward, making the fatal mistake of believing he could still win this confrontation. There comes a moment in every battle when retreat becomes impossible and surrender unthinkable. A moment when dignity demands action, when silence becomes complicity, when a man must stand up and be counted regardless of the consequences. For Sylvester Stallone, sitting in that studio with millions watching, facing a host who seemed determined to reduce his life's work to a series of punchlines, that moment arrived with crystalline clarity. The air turned lean when Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his smile taking on a quality that suggested he thought he'd found an angle, a way to turn the tide back in his favor. "So Sly," he said, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "What's next? A line of anti-aging supplements? Maybe a reality show?" Keeping up with the comebacks, the audience chuckled weakly, but the sound was strained, hesitant. They felt what was coming, even if they couldn't name it. The moment had changed, transformed into something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of genuine human conflict. Stallone exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry years of accumulated frustration, decades of being underestimated and dismissed. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the studio. "It's funny. You sit in that chair and poke fun like it's armor. But at some point, the jokes stop being clever and start becoming noise." Jimmy shrugged, trying to project casual indifference, even as his body language betrayed his growing discomfort. "It's just TV, man. You know that." Stallone's voice dropped even lower, taking on a quality that made people strain to hear, that commanded absolute attention. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. And in those words was an indictment not just of Jimmy Kimmel, but of an entire culture that had normalized mockery, that had made cruelty into entertainment. You treat everything like a punchline, even the people who came here with a story worth telling. A hush swept through the studio like a physical force. People stopped shifting in their seats. Phones were lowered, forgotten. Every eye fixed on the two men on stage, on the confrontation that was reaching its inevitable climax. Jimmy chuckled nervously, the sound hollow and forced. "Don't be so sensitive, Sly. You've taken real punches. Surely you can take a few words." And then Stallone stood up. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, carrying the weight of finality. He rose from his chair with the grace of a man who'd made a decision and found peace in it. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the room. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how late-night interviews ended. This was something else entirely. Something that would be replayed and analyzed and debated for years to come. "I've taken enough," Stallone said, standing tall beside the chair that now seemed impossibly small, impossibly confining. His voice filled the studio without rising in volume, carried by the force of conviction rather than the power of lungs. "And I've given enough to this industry, to this audience, to the spirit of what real storytelling is about." Jimmy stood too, his movements quick and uncertain, trying to control the optics of a situation that had already spiraled beyond his ability to manage. "Hey, where are you going?" he asked, his voice taking on an edge of panic disguised as humor. "We're not done." Stallone turned to face the crowd, his back to Jimmy now, his attention given entirely to the people who had watched this unfold. "But I am," he said simply. The audience was silent for one heartbeat, 2, 3, and then applause erupted. Not scattered or polite, but thunderous, overwhelming. The kind of response that shakes the walls and drowns out thought. People stood, dozens of them, then more. Then nearly everyone, rising to their feet in solidarity with the man who'd just done what they'd all wanted to do at some point in their lives, walk away from disrespect with dignity intact. Jimmy tried to laugh it off, his professional instincts kicking in even as his world crumbled around him. "Don't worry, folks," he said, addressing the cameras with forced levity. "Next week, we'll have someone with a sense of humor." Stallone paused at the edge of the stage. His hand was on the curtain that separated the bright lights of performance from the shadows of backstage reality. He could have walked through, could have left on that note, could have let the moment stand as it was. But something made him turn back. Some instinct or impulse or deeply held belief that the moment required one final statement. His eyes scanned the studio, taking in the standing audience, the frozen crew members, the cameras that continued to roll despite the chaos. Behind his gaze was everything he'd lived through. The years of rejection, the nights sleeping in bus stations, the choice to sell his dog for money to eat, the moment when Rocky changed everything, the decades of fighting to be taken seriously as a writer and actor and human being. All of it was there in his eyes, visible to anyone who knew how to look. "You know," he said slowly, his voice carrying a finality that made it clear these would be his last words on the stage. "I've spent a lifetime building characters who fight for something." He paused, letting the words settle over the room like snow. Maybe it's time late night did the same. The camera operators scrambled to follow him as he turned and walked toward the backstage area, but the angles were wrong. The movements, too, rushed. The image cut awkwardly back to Jimmy, who stood blinking under the harsh lights, his mouth opening and closing without sound. A man who'd suddenly discovered that the script he'd been following no longer applied. Backstage was chaos. Crew members stood frozen, unsure whether to applaud or pretend nothing had happened, caught between professional neutrality and personal response. A camera operator, younger than most, began clapping first. Then others joined in, a ripple of recognition that spread through the backstage area like fire. Several people nodded as Stallone passed, their expressions mixing respect and vindication. One young intern, barely out of college, whispered loud enough to be heard, "Thank you." Stallone didn't acknowledge the responses, didn't slow his stride or look back. He walked with the same dignity he'd shown throughout the confrontation. His shoulders squared, his head high, a man who'd said what needed saying and needed nothing more from anyone present. The moment his car door closed and he was driven away from the studio, the world exploded. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, every social media platform lit up simultaneously as millions of people who'd watched the confrontation unfold live began processing what they'd witnessed. Hashtags formed spontaneously. Respect Stallone. Stallone vs. Kimmel. Late night gone wrong. Within minutes, the segment was trending worldwide. Memes flooded the internet. A still image of Stallone standing tall, his expression calm and resolute, became an instant icon. The caption written by some unknown genius read simply, "Strength isn't loud, it's dignified." That image, that phrase, captured something essential about what people had just witnessed, something that resonated far beyond the specific confrontation between an actor and a talk show host. News outlets picked up the story immediately. Entertainment reporters scrambled to provide context, to explain what had happened and why it mattered. The segment was replayed endlessly, dissected frame by frame, every word analyzed for deeper meaning. Pundits weighed in. Celebrities offered their perspectives. Fans defended their positions with passionate intensity. Arnold Schwarzenegger tweeted within the hour, "This is why Sly will always be a champion. Some people build others up. Some people tear them down. History remembers which is which." Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson posted a thoughtful video. "There's a difference between humor and humiliation. Real strength is knowing when to stand your ground." Directors who'd worked with Stallone spoke to reporters about his professionalism, his dedication, his genuine belief in the power of storytelling to change lives. Athletes who'd been inspired by Rocky talked about what his characters had meant to them during their darkest moments. Teachers discussed showing Rocky to their students as an example of perseverance. The story grew beyond the confrontation itself, becoming a referendum on respect, on dignity, on the price of entertainment in an age where cruelty had been normalized as comedy. Within 24 hours, Stallone walkout had accumulated over 50 million mentions across all platforms. Think pieces appeared in major publications. The New York Times ran an editorial titled "When Entertainment Forgets Its Humanity." The Guardian published the death of gracious celebrity interviews. Even industry trades like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter devoted extensive coverage to analyzing what the moment meant for late-night television's future. Jimmy Kimmel issued a statement the next day, carefully crafted by publicists and legal teams. "We have enormous respect for Sylvester Stallone and his contributions to cinema. Comedy sometimes pushes boundaries, and we regret if last night's conversation crossed lines that made our guest uncomfortable. It was a non-apology apology, the kind that acknowledges something happened without taking real responsibility for it, and people saw through it immediately. The ratings told their own story. The episode became the most watched late-night segment in 5 years. Millions who'd never watched Jimmy
Kimmel sought out the footage.
Millions more rewatched it multiple times, analyzing every expression, every word, every shift in body language. The video accumulated hundreds of millions of views across YouTube, Twitter, and other platforms. But beyond the metrics and the headlines and the social media firestorm, something deeper had occurred. Stallone hadn't just walked out of a studio. He'd walked into a moment that captured something millions of people felt, but rarely saw expressed with such clarity: that dignity matters. That respect is not optional, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, no matter how many laughs it might generate. He'd reminded the world that behind every celebrity, every public figure, every person put on display for entertainment, there's a human being with a history, with struggles, with a story that deserves to be honored rather than mocked. He'd shown that it's possible to stand up for yourself without losing your temper, to defend your worth without descending to cruelty, to walk away with your head high when staying would mean compromising your values. In the days that followed, something interesting happened in the entertainment industry. Other celebrities, emboldened by Stallone's example, began pushing back against interview tactics they found disrespectful. Late-night shows started reevaluating their approach to comedy, their bookers having harder conversations about boundaries and respect. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a shift, a recognition that something fundamental had changed. Stallone himself remained characteristically quiet about the incident. He didn't give interviews about it, didn't write op-eds, didn't seek to capitalize on the attention. He simply returned to his work, to the projects he believed in, to the characters and stories that had always mattered most to him. His silence spoke volumes, suggesting that he'd said everything that needed saying in that studio, and the rest was for others to interpret as they would. What started as just another late-night appearance had transformed into a cultural moment, a line of demarcation between old ways and new thinking, between entertainment that elevates and entertainment that diminishes. It exposed not just egos but values, not just personalities but principles. And at the center of it all stood a 78-year-old man who'd spent his entire career teaching people that being knocked down doesn't define you, getting back up does. Stallone didn't storm out in anger. He didn't throw a tantrum or issue threats or resort to the kind of behavior that would have undermined his message. He simply stood up, spoke his truth with quiet dignity, and walked away when staying would have meant accepting treatment he knew he didn't deserve. And in doing so, he gave millions of people permission to do the same in their own lives, in their own contexts when they encountered disrespect disguised as humor. The audience in that studio and the millions watching at home knew they'd witnessed something real. Not a manufactured controversy designed to boost rating. Not a publicity stunt coordinated between celebrity and host, but a genuine moment of human confrontation handled with grace under pressure that revealed character in both men involved. Who was right? Who went too far? The questions echoed across social media, in break rooms and dinner tables, anywhere people gathered to discuss what they'd seen. But perhaps those weren't the right questions. Perhaps what mattered wasn't determining fault or assigning blame, but recognizing what the moment revealed about respect, about dignity, about the stories we tell, and the way we treat those who tell them. This wasn't just another talk show episode. This was a turning point, a moment when millions of people simultaneously realized that entertainment doesn't have to come at the cost of human dignity, that humor doesn't require humiliation, that we can laugh without making someone else cry. And it took a 78-year-old man who'd spent decades fighting fictional battles on screen to remind us how to fight for something real. Our own worth, our own story, our own right to be treated with basic human respect. The lights in that studio eventually dimmed. The audience filed out, still buzzing with what they'd witnessed. The crew broke down the set, following the same routines they'd followed 1,000 times before. Jimmy Kimmel went home to face whatever private reckoning awaited him. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Sylvester Stallone moved forward with his life, carrying the same dignity he displayed on that stage, unchanged by the storm of attention, secure in the knowledge that he'd done what needed doing. The story would be retold countless times in the years to come, each retelling adding new layers of interpretation, new insights, new understanding, but the core would remain unchanged. The night Sylvester Stallone reminded the world that some lines shouldn't be crossed, some values aren't negotiable, and sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply stand up and walk away.